The topic we're discussing here is feminism. Feminism. Of course, I've dedicated a good portion of my academic energy, not just teaching the subject matter, but also studying it and writing about it. And as is with all topics within social sciences, the more you know, the less you think you knew about it. And feminism is really no exception to this rule, because we're dealing with a vast body of knowledge embedded in this category that we call feminism. Began ascendancy in 18th century, around the time. But also we can conceive feminism, if we were to unpack it as a concept, as an idea or a set of ideas, is what I mean by a concept here. If we were to unpack it as a concept, it could connote so many different things. On one level, for example, we can understand feminism as representing a social or political movement, So here, what stands out as feminism is that idea of collective action, which would then culminate into a social or revolutionary movement. At the same time, we can understand it as an intellectual trend, as an intellectual endeavor, how the world operates and how to think about it, based on a certain philosophy about social life. At the same time, we can think about it as a theory or a theoretical trend when we reference feminism. The literature tells us that theory is a simplifying device that has been invented in order to explain a particular social or political phenomenon. So in that sense, we can think about feminism as a theory for understanding certain phenomena taking shape in the social world. However, what I'm suggesting is the best way to understand feminism is to think about it as a discourse. When we reference a phenomenon, a discourse, we mean it in the sense that here there is a mode of storytelling. Discourses always materialize at the conjunction of power and knowledge when we speak about a discourse. Discourse is that intersection that explains where power and knowledge collide. But at the same time, when you speak about discourse, we mean a pattern ways of thinking about certain ideas and buzzwords, which could then encompass a theory, an intellectual movement, and a particular way of looking at life. All of these would be under the banner of this thing that we call discourse. But we all know that with each and every discourses, certain prevailing words, concepts are privileged at the expense of others. We've noticed that with nearly all the political ideologies we have discussed so far in the course, and feminism is no exception to this rule, that here we are privileging certain concepts over others. Why? So goes the argument, because these concepts tell us something about the operation of power and knowledge in practice. And so here, with respect to the feminist discourse, one of the buzzword that is omnipresent is the concept of patriarchy. Patriarchy. With patriarchy, we mean a particular social or political system. So, a mode of community building that is deeply social and or political. But with patriarchy, we also mean a system of organizing society or thinking about governance, exercise of power. That is about the male authority. And one of the omnipresent buzzwords within this discourse that we call feminism is patriarchy. The assumption here is that the understanding of the world is entrenched in this concept because it privileges manpower to the detriment of women. So patriarchy is one. Another one is the concept of masculinity. Masculinity. Another prevailing concept within feminism. When we speak about masculinity, here, what we have in mind is certain characteristics that are associated with manliness. Manliness. And for the feminists, that's always problematic. Because what we associate with manliness, the way we have ended up doing it, what we have associated with manliness, we have also associated with our politics, local and international. And so these characteristics of what constitutes manliness, independence, rationality, physical courage, and power, domination, independence, and the list goes on and on. These are not neutral categories, they say. They are implicated in power relations. Again, that privileges not only manliness in society and politics, but the feminist also understands masculinity as a mode of signification. So this thing that we call politics of signification has everything to do with patriarchy and masculinity. The way I can unpack this further for you is by inviting you to think about a third prevailing concept within feminism: gender. And by gender, they mean something quite specific. A socially and culturally constructed dichotomy. At other times, they call it, or they define it, and by that I mean gender, as a socially and culturally mode of signifying certain dichotomies. The argument is this: if you associate certain characteristics with masculinity, that the masculine is rational, that the masculine is independent, then these characteristics are always contrasted against certain buzzwords that pit men against women. When they speak about socially and culturally constructed dichotomies, they speak about the difference or the way in which the literature or public discourse contrasts between man and woman, public and private, rational and irrational, rational and emotional. The argument is that the category that is associated with masculinity always takes a higher value to the detriment of the one or the value that is associated with feminine. Starting with the distinction between man and woman. 2, rational and irrational. Who has been traditionally considered as rational and who has been conceived as purely emotional. So there are power relations implicated in construction of these dichotomies. These modes of signification symbolizes women as inherently inferior to men. So goes the argument. But chances are, and that's something that you need to know about research, as I always invite you to think about it. Once you take on the discourse or write a research project predicated upon the feminist discourse, it is always the case that there is no escaping from articulating one of these key buzzwords, if not all three. The sine qua non for the feminist cause is and has always been gender equality. How to achieve full equality and independence for women. So that's the crux of the analysis. They understand politics as a deeply gendered activity. When a feminist writes, for example, about war, they conceive war as a deeply gendered activity. Because what masculinity, as a sub-discourse here, privileges, is raw power, domination, and independence. All these ideal type categories that we associate with the category of war. So war for a feminist is, again, a gendered activity. So is politics and society. So much here to unpack with respect to what they are saying. If we were to speak about I should say, a genealogy of the feminist discourse, a genealogy of the feminist discourse, perhaps one of the foundational texts is The Vindication of the Rights of Women by Mary Wollstonecraft, 1792, when she published it. I call it one of the foundational texts because it was there that Wollstonecraft articulated the idea that women possess the same degree of rational thinking as men. And if this is not the case, and if this is not the norm in the society, it has to do with the fact that they have been deprived of an education. So that was a radical departing point at the time. But it also tells you how women were conceived in the historical context of the time as purely irrational or entirely emotional, capable of resorting to reason. But Wollstonecraft spoke about the social order that can be predicated upon reason, where both men and women are involved in its creation. At the same time, while not explicitly speaking about the concept of gender equality, she did not explicitly speak about it or reference it. She does bring up the point that men and women are equal in certain domains, for example, morality, or they're equal in the sight of God, that kind of a phrase. And they should be granted much better social and political role beyond the mere a domain of pleasing men, that kind of an argument. She would pass away only a few short years later, after the publication of Vindication of Rights of Men. And at the time, the publication was well received. No question about that it was well received. But right after her passing, her husband, William Godwin, a journalist, a theorist, and one of the forefathers of the anarchist movement, would write a memoir about her. And in a sense, sabotaging her character. The fact that she committed suicide a number of times. She had illegitimate children, a number of love affairs, always, or all of which were brought to the fore. So Vindication of the Rights of Women was kind of sidelined from history for at least a century, before the advent of this thing that we call the feminist movement here in the Western world in the 20th century. It was then again read and debated. 1792, when she passed away a few years later, only a few days after her daughter Mary Shelley was born, and she would become later an accomplished writer, the author of Frankenstein. And I know someone who are nodding and know this. Many nowadays argue that feminine traits or feminist traits can be taken up and applied to politics for bringing about a radically different understanding of the world, if not the creation of a new world order. Many feminists who write in international relations studies speak about this point, that the values and qualities that women are associated with in the context of nurturing, cooperation, persuasion, and moral courage can bring about a radically different understanding of politics. But at the same time, we're also speaking about a host of different writers here. A host of different writers. There is no one or singular unified camp when we speak about the discourse on feminism. And aside from the four classifications you see here, liberal, socialist, radical, and feminist, there are many different subcategories or so-called subcategories when we speak about feminism. Most of these categories are grounded in what we call critical theory within social sciences: postmodernist feminists, post-structuralist feminists, post-colonial feminists, and the list goes on and on. And depending on who you study, they have much different understanding and articulation of what the feminist cause should be about. Majority of the feminists are influenced by Michel Foucault's understanding of power. Not only they take issue with power and power dynamics as these things, or power as this thing that dominates and exploits only, they also take up Foucault because Foucault gives them an avenue to think about power in a positive light, as this thing that produces, or as this thing that creates the condition of possibility for resistance, which is integral to their project of resisting masculinity, or masculine politics, as they call it. As Foucault famously postulated, where there is power, there is resistance. So, for example, in her seminal work, The Politics of Piety, Saba Mahmoud takes up Foucault to speak about feminist activism, making the argument that there are no universal categories of act beyond the moral and ethical framework within which they become relevant. Judith Butler, another one, writes about politics of performativity or performative politics. An interesting argument she's advancing. What is she telling us about performative politics? That gender is not a manifestation of who you are, but an expression of what you do. Not so much biological, but socially constructed. It is what you perform in your everyday life, socially and politically, that determines your gender. It's not a pre-ascribed category that is assigned to you upon birth. It is performed. Much the same thing is about or said about gender or gender identity. That identity is not pre-given. It has everything to do with what you perform socially. That kind of an argument. And there are many different other camps among them. And as I go over these arguments, I bring some of that discussion into fore for you. For them, knowledge is a deeply political project. It's deeply political because it serves the interest of those who subscribe to a masculine discourse. They take issue with the dichotomy that pits objective against subjective knowledge. Objective means, or when we speak about objective knowledge, we mean that kind of a knowledge that is based on fact. With subjective, we mean a kind of a knowledge production that is based on opinion. They say both are politically charged. Perhaps what we need is what Donna Haraway, another leading feminist, called situated knowledge. A kind of a knowledge that is relational to the time and context within which a social or political phenomenon is explained or expounded. And she famously coined this term called God trick when speaking about objective knowledge. Voices pretending to offer a vision, a kind of a knowledge that is from everywhere but in fact nowhere, she said. So in that kind of a context, their argument is that the production of knowledge can be quite biased because even knowledge production may and can be gendered. We're speaking about 4 strands of feminism here. And I want to begin by going over the liberal discourse on feminism. With the liberal feminists, we're talking about a particular camp that seeks to advance the notion of women being entitled to legal and political rights to domains such as employment and education. So the right to vote is there. The right to engage in associations, engage in social movements are there. The right to life, liberty, and personal security is what they are advocating for. But the referent object of knowledge for them is, or are, I should say, the referent objects of knowledge are domains having to do with education and employment. Why do they focus on this? Because the bulk of the analysis for the liberal feminists has to do with the concept of equality of opportunity. that's what's been missing, because there has been quite a bit of discrimination, historically speaking, against women. In this case, the argument comes closest to what Wollstonecraft argued about women's education. That what is missing from this link to empowering women is education. Because with education, then better job opportunities can also be secured. So if you put me on spot and ask me, what is that one thing that is promoted in the context of knowledge by the liberal feminist? My answer would immediately be equality of opportunity. Equality of opportunity. And how it could be achieved or materialized? For the liberal feminist, the stock is always placed on the category of the state. The state is in charge of ensuring equality of opportunity. The state is in charge of ensuring that justice is materialized and safeguarded. You know, many feminists in IR are also speaking about the state, but at the same time, they critique this way of thinking. Spike Peterson is one of them, who coined the concept of gendered state, as she called it. Gendered state. What is her argument? What is she saying? What she's telling us is that at the time that the majority of these social contract theories were articulated, women were never included in the debate. And because they were never included in the debate, as such, they were relegated to the private sphere of the home, wherein they were looked upon as duty-bound subjects. So they never really contributed to the discourse on citizenship, because they were never in the public sphere to even being able to articulate it. So in this context, their autonomy and agency was lost. So for Peterson, categories like citizen or citizenship are deeply and politically biased, gendered. Hence her conception of gendered state. Yet for the liberal feminists, it's much the same thing, in that the panacea is placed upon the category of the state to ensure equality of opportunity is provided. The second camp, the socialist feminists. Socialism and the feminist strand. You notice, based on what is said on the board, they're taking issue with two things. The first one has to do, of course, with patriarchy, this male-dominated orientation of society. But they also bring in the category that is capitalism. The argument is that capitalism by default produces inequality. And so they liken the relationship between the capitalist boss and the worker to the way in which male-female dynamics are unfolding in all capitalist societies. Women have been on the losing side of this interrelationship for a number of reasons, they argue. Mainly, or one reason, has to do with the fact that their role has been confined to child rearing and reproduction. So that's one. An army or a reserved army of cheap labor is what they're providing to the process of capitalist production. Another one. Many others who sympathize with this approach also have expanded or expounded and articulated this concept. J.Ann Tickner is one of them. At the beginnings of capitalism, she argues, because women were always excluded from the citizenship discourse, because they were consigned to the private sphere of the home, they were never involved really in the sphere of, or on the debate in the sphere of economic production. So for them, categories such as breadwinner or head of the household becomes quite gendered again. So we end up the same spot that V. Spike Peterson landed. With the with the socialist feminists, some of them argue that the capitalist boss and worker relationship also manifests in the household, in the sphere of family, in that the same power dynamic draws the relationship between a husband and a wife. What are they looking for, politically, socially speaking? Free provision of childcare is one of them. They have been longing for it. In other words, what they're saying, or the way in which they're critiquing the liberal feminists, is that what good is the equality of opportunity if there is no equality of outcome? Because the argument is, or so goes the argument, capitalism by default produces inequality. So this category that they call equality of outcome can never be achieved. Overcoming the sexual division of labor is another one. The project is deeply social, but at the same time political here. Now to the radical feminists. To the radical feminists. You must have heard the buzzwords or the phrases personal is political or private is political. You know, one way to remember them is with reference to these statements. For them, the key category has to do with women's oppression. They look at it in historical terms. And essentially what they're saying is that when you look at women's subordination from public and political life, you come to realize that this is one of the most prolonged, boldest cases of oppression in human history. That's how they look at it, in that kind of a way, or that kind of a light. The project for them is nothing short of revolutionary. Nothing short of revolutionary. Because the end political objective is about what they call liberation. Sometimes even the buzzword emancipation is used interchangeably. But liberation. So, two prevailing buzzwords here. One has to do with a wholesome revolution, another, liberation as the social and political objective. Let me unpack these two. When you speak about revolution, or I should say when they speak about revolution, what they have in mind is a wholesome transformation of state-society relationship. A wholesome transformation of state-society relationship. It's not just about ending the male domination of power politics. It's about deconstructing our political institutions before they can be rebuilt again. So that the project of liberation goes beyond freedom. It's about entirely or a kind of a transformation that is quite wholesome in the context of humanity's institutional framework. And this transformation must also take place from the sphere that is family. So the roles can be reconstituted. So it's not just top down, but it's also bottom up, the kind of project that they're advancing. And last but not least, Islamic feminism. A discourse on feminism that began in the early 1990s. Early 1990s in places like Iran and Egypt, Middle East and North Africa. For them, the crux of the matter has to do with the politics of invisibility, which is really one of the preoccupations of nearly all feminists, that women have always been subjected to invisibility, or what they call politics of invisibility. For example, by way of being consigned to the private sphere of home. And Islamic feminists take up that issue. I've interviewed many of them. In 2022, I published in the Journal of International Women's Studies a paper entitled Presence as Resistance, Feminist Activism and the Politics of Social Contestation in Iran. So I had to interview many of them to get a sense of what is it that they're saying about this public-private divide. The reason I called it Presence as Resistance was because I noticed a trend taking shape in Iranian politics and Iranian society as early as 2008. Scores of Iranian women are increasingly bicycling in public spheres. You might be thinking to yourself then, so what? Well, it is frowned upon. At some point, it was illegal for them to bicycle in public spheres. They could do it in the private sphere of their home, but not in public spaces, which in the Middle East and North Africa is the locus of revolution. Nearly all cases of revolutionary movements have taken shape in public spaces or from public spaces in the Middle East and North Africa. And I noticed that increasingly from 2008 onward, more and more women are engaging in everyday bicycling. The matter became a national security issue. One mullah during a Friday sermon mentioned that women who are bicycling are in fact insulting God. Another one, Tehran's Friday prayer, and one of the most powerful mullahs in the country, mentioned during another Friday sermon that women who are engaging in bicycling are fueling the sexual instinct of the youth. The matter became such an issue that in 2016, the Ayatollah Khamenei, Iran's supreme leader, had to intervene and issue a fatwa or religious ruling banning this practice. Despite this official censor, I showed in the article that more and more women, legions of Iranian women, are occupying public spaces in defiance of his rule, engaging in bicycling, presenting the Islamic Republic of Iran with a dilemma. On the one hand, arresting or imprisoning scores of Iranian women on a daily basis can ensure that the regime keeps the system intact, but at one cost, turning public spaces into militarized zones, something that no government can afford to do for an extended period of time. At the same time, relaxing or ignoring the rules of public conduct would ensure that many more are pouring into public spaces. And by doing that, they're bringing the state into their sensibilities, reconfiguring power relations to the point that now, in 2024, you notice that many of Iranian women are now walking in public spaces without following the hijab rule that is mandatory. So we're talking about that kind of an impact. I called it presence as resistance. The performance in public spaces, I conceptualized it. The performance of Iranian women in public spaces by engaging in those acts that are reserved either for men or private sphere of the home. And I show the kind of radical social and political change that this simple mundane act is bringing to the fore. In this case, breaking in the bounds of politics of invisibility by simply presenting themselves in public spaces in numbers. And the movement was supported by the leading lights of Islamic feminists. Many of them are teaching in North America, Nayireh Tauhidi, Ziba Mir Hosseini, all of them. What is it that they're looking for? The discourse is about a blend of religiosity and rights. I want to begin there. Religiosity and rights, because many of their advocates are devout Muslims. There is something authentic about it because they're not necessarily rejecting spirituality or religion as such. It is just that they are against the mandatory imposition of hijab. Many of them are themselves devout Muslim and observe the hijab injunction. Many of them. So that distinction must be made, that they are against the politicized imposition of it by the state. It should be a matter of choice, the argument is. Ending inequality in all domains, public and private, when you talk to them and ask them, what is the political objective here? So ending women's subordination is the objective. How are they trying to achieve it? That becomes the key question. Their argument is that monopoly over the interpretation of Islamic legal system, which is called fiqh, F-I-Q-H, must be wrestled from the male clergy. That we should be involved in expounding what the Islamic legal system should be, not them. So that's one, that Islam could accommodate women's voices only if it is read through a feminist text or a feminist lens, I should say. Then again, the political objective becomes about the desubordination of women, ensuring full equality and autonomy in public and private domain. We are right at the end of the lecture. When we meet next, we go over the very last remaining topic, which is on Islamism. Have a great day, everyone.